Shell money is a medium of exchange similar to money that was once commonly used in many parts of the world. Shell money usually consisted either of whole seashells or pieces of them, which were often worked into beads or were otherwise artificially shaped. The use of shells in trade began as direct commodity exchange, the shells having value as body ornamentation. The distinction between beads as commodities and beads as money has been the subject of debate among economic anthropologists. Some form of shell money appears to have been found on almost every continent: America, Asia, Africa, and Australia. The shell most widely used worldwide as currency was the shell of Cypria moneta, the money cowry. This species is most abundant in the Indian Ocean, and was collected in the Maldives Islands, in Sri Lanka, along the Malabar coast, in Borneo and on other East Indian islands, and in various parts of the African coast from Ras Afun to Mozambique. Cowry shell money was important at one time or another in the trade networks of Africa, South Asia, and East Asia. Africa. In Western Africa, shell money was usual legal tender up until the mid-19th century. Before the abolition of the slave trade, large shipments of cowry shells were sent to some of the English ports for reshipment to the slave coast. It was also common in West-Central Africa as the currency of the Kingdom of Congo, called locally Nimbu. As the value of the cowry was much greater in West Africa than in the regions from which the supply was obtained, the trade was extremely lucrative. In some cases the gains are said to have been 500%. The use of the cowry currency gradually spread inland in Africa. By about 1850 the German explorer Heinrich Barth found it fairly widespread in Kano, Kuka, Ganda, and even Timbuktu. Barth relates that in Munyama, one of the ancient divisions of Bornu, the king's revenue was estimated at 30 million shells, with every adult male being required to pay annually 1,000 shells for himself, 1,000 for every pack-ox, and 2,000 for every slave in his possession. In the countries on the coast, the shells were fastened together in strings of 40 or 100 each, so that 50 or 20 strings represented $1, but in the interior they were laboriously counted one by one, or, if the traders were expert, 5 by 5. The districts mentioned above received the supply of kurdi, as they were called, from the west coast, but the regions to the north of Unyamwezi, where they were in use under the name of Simba, were dependent on Muslim traders from Zanzibar. The shells were used in the remoter parts of Africa until the early 20th century, but then gave way to modern currencies. The shell of the large land snail, Achatina monetaria, cut into circles with an open center, was also used as coin in Bengala, Portuguese West Africa, East, South and Southeast Asia. In China, cowries were so important that many characters relating to money trade contain the character for cowry. Starting over 3,000 years ago, cowry shells, or copies of the shells, were used as Chinese currency. The classical Chinese character for money, currency, originated as a pictograph of a cowry shell. Cowries were formerly used as means of exchange in India. In Bengal, where it required 3,840 to make a rupee, the annual importation was valued at about 30,000 rupees. In Southeast Asia, when the value of the Siamese tickle was about half a troy ounce of silver, the value of the cowry was fixed at 1/6,400th baht. In modern Thailand, it refers to interest paid for the use of money borrowed or deposited. Biawat is a military pension. In Orissa, India, cowry the currency was used till 1805, which was replaced by the British East India Company, which was one of the causes of Pake Rebellion in 1817. Oceania and Australia. In northern Australia, Australia, different shells were used by different tribes, one tribe's shell often being quite worthless in the eyes of another tribe. In the islands north of New Guinea, the shells were broken into flakes. Holes were bored through these flakes, which were then valued by the length of a threaded set on a string, as measured using the finger joints. Two shells are used by these Pacific Islanders, one a cowry found on the New Guinea coast, and the other the common pearl shell, broken into flakes. In the South Pacific Islands, the species Oliva carniana was commonly used to create shell money. As late as 1882, local trade in the Solomon Islands was carried on by means of a coinage of shell beads. Small shells laboriously ground down to the required size by the women. No more than were actually needed were made, and as the process was difficult, the value of the coinage was satisfactorily maintained. On the Papua New Guinea island of East New Britain, shell currency is still considered legal currency and can be exchanged for kina. North America. The length of a number of shells strung on thread was also a measure used by native North American to value the dentalium shell, a type of tusk shell. The length of the strung tusk shell currency was measured between the nipples of the breasts. The shell most valued by the Native American tribes of the Pacific coast from Alaska to northwest California was dentalium shell, a species of long narrow marine-shelled mollusk, a tusk shell, a scaphoid. The tusk shell is naturally open at both ends and can easily be strung on a thread. This shell money was valued by its length rather than the exact number of shells. The ligue, the highest denomination in their currency, was a length of about 6 inches. Farther south, in central California and southern California, the shell of the olive snail Olivella biplicator was used to make beads for at least 9,000 years. The small numbers recovered in older archaeological site components suggest that they were initially used as ornamentation, rather than as money, beginning shortly before 1,000 years ago. Jewish specialists on the islands of California's Santa Barbara Channel began shipping beads from olive shells in such quantities that they left meter-deep piles of manufacturing residue in the wake. The resulting circular beads were used as money throughout the area that is now Southern California, starting at about AD 1500 and continuing into the late 19th century. The Coast Miwok, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, and Wapo peoples of central California used the marine bivalve Saxidomus sp. to make shell money. On the east coast of North America, the members of the Iroquois Confederacy and Algonquin tribes, such as the Shinnecock tribe, ground beads called wampum, which were cut from the purple part of the shell of the marine bivalve Mercenaria mercenaria, more commonly known as the hard clamor quahog. White beads were cut from the white part of the quahog whelk shells. Iroquois peoples wove these shells in belts. West and Southwest Asia. In parts of Asia, Cypria annulus, the ring cowry, so called because of the bright orange-colored ring on the back or upper side of the shell, was commonly used. Many specimens were found by Sir Austin Henry Laird in his excavations at Nimrud in 1845 to 1851.